Is okay?
Sorry, one more thing, just some water.
Yep. Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to another amazing webinar, part of the SWACON series. It is wonderful to have you all join us for today's conversation. The SWACON series is jointly hosted by the Swatantrata Center and South Asia Students for Liberty. And today we have a very special session for all of you. We are joined in by Dr. Nigel Ashford. He is a senior programs officer at the Institute for Humane Studies. He joined IHS from the United Kingdom, where he was the professor of politics and the Jean Monnet Scholar in European Integration at Staffordshire University, England. Dr. Ashford is also the chairman of the American Politics Group of the United Kingdom. He has lectured in 19 countries. He is the author of Principles for a Free Society, which is available in 8 languages. He is the co-author of US Politics Today and many other articles to his name. Dr. Ashford works on many of the Institute's educational programs, which is the Institute of Humane Studies. He liaises with the IHS faculty network, produces regular academic newsletters for faculty and graduate students. And I must also, specify here that I have been affiliated in one way or the other through with his work, and I've benefited as someone who is an academic enthusiast. So today he will be speaking on classical liberalism and its relevance today. Ever since we had the pandemic, we've had questions over the nature of whether free market ideas, whether classical liberal ideas stand the test of time. And today we have Dr. Nigel Ashford to talk with us on that. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I will say that after my talk, you should get a email with a link to other talks, articles I've written, so that you can follow these ideas in more depth. So the last 75 years has seen a dramatic increase in the influence of liberal ideas in the world. The result has been increasing prosperity, growing social freedom, increasing peace. In other words, we've seen an enormous explosion of human flourishing. So we've seen a rapid decline in the number of people in extreme poverty. In India, for example, over 270 million people have moved out of extreme poverty. We've seen growing freedom of the individual for people to make choices about their own lives, especially for women and for minorities of all types, racial, religion, and sexual. Look at the Human Freedom Index. And we've seen a significant decline in the amount of violence. This is often not recognized because as violence becomes lower, people become more conscious of the violence that does exist. But there has been a significant decline of violence. Look at Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. So this great increase in human flourishing. However, liberalism is under attack from many sources, but I would say the most significant attack comes from the rise of identity politics. So on the right, the emphasis on nationalist and religious identity, sometimes called populist nationalism. And from the left, racial and minority identity, sometimes called progressivism. So liberals they see the individual as made up as a variety of different identities. So straight or gay, religious or secular, married or single, black or white, highly educated or not, that each individual has a variety of different identities, and that's what makes them a unique individual. But the new identity politics, that says that you have only one dominant identity, and that if you don't share that identity with others, you have nothing in common with those others. And the result of this growth identity politics is deep polarization and distrust. So what we need is a restoration of liberal principles and a call for the end for divisive politics. So I'm going to talk about classical liberalism and what it means, sometimes called libertarianism. It's a school of thought that places the freedom of the individual at its core. Key figures in this classical liberal tradition are people like Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman. The list could go on. What I'm going to do is to describe 10 key principles of classical liberalism and then compare and contrast that with other ideologies. Now, I think classical liberalism is universal in nature. It applies to everyone, everywhere. However, we know that countries different, cultures different. So how you apply these ideas will vary on in your own circumstances. So you're the expert in your own country, only you will know what is the best way of applying these principles in your own situation. One thing I do encourage you to do is to try and identify your own classical liberal tradition in your own country, in your own society, to give you a guidance of how to achieve that. So I'm going to describe 10 key principles of classical liberalism. I'm going to be very bold, just state them directly. I'm not here going to try and defend them to any degree of depth. So the first principle is that freedom is the most important political value. It is not the most important value. Each individual chooses for themselves what they think is important. Is it their family? Is it their religion? Is it their friends? Is it their work? Each people choosing for themselves what they think has value for them, what they believe is the good life. So freedom is the instrument to enable them to pursue what they themselves value, the pursuit of happiness as they understand it. Now, obviously, there are limits to freedom. They would be, the most important one, I would say, is the harm principle. You should be free to do whatever you want as long as you do not harm another person. So freedom is the most important political value. This is how you judge whether political decisions are good or bad. Do they increase freedom or do they reduce freedom? Second principle is that the individual is more important than the collective and the group. The group exists to help the individual to be able to achieve their own goals. So, for example, you might be able to reduce the absolute amount of crime by punishing an innocent person. That might be said to be for the common good, but it would be morally wrong to punish that individual. It would be the wrong way to treat people. This is the principle of human dignity, that every individual is worthy of consideration. Third principle, classical liberals are skeptical about power because they believe that those who are given power will use it for their own benefit. If government has a role to play in the economy, politicians would tend to use it to favor their own interests, the sectors of people who support them. We've seen this with the police. When they've been given too much power, they've tended to abuse that power. So always skeptical about those with power. Fourth principle, a free society requires the rule of law. This is the idea that there are certain higher principles which should be applied to every legislative and executive decision by government. There are several of these principles under the rule of law. The most important one, I would say, is equality before the law, that the law should treat people the same, regardless of whether they're male or female, or what their religious views are, what their sexual orientation is. And it's not only a question about the laws themselves shouldn't discriminate, but also the application of laws should not discriminate, the rule of law. Fifth principle, social problems are best dealt with by civil society, by the family, by churches, by charities, by voluntary organizations, rather than by government. That civil society knows better about how to help people than some big government bureaucracy does. So if you have the elderly person in your community, they're best looked after by some sort of local voluntary organization who knows their situation, that person better, than by some anonymous government social worker, civil society. Six, order enables people to go around about their business without being interfered with, but with knowing about, if I want to achieve A, these are the rules that will enable me to achieve that particular goal. So order is important, but order is best left spontaneously. The rules should emerge from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Adam Smith captured this idea in his concept of the invisible hand. So spontaneous order. 7, free markets are superior to government intervention in creating wealth, in providing good employment, and reducing poverty. Classical liberals recognize there is such a thing as market failure. Markets are not perfect, but there's also something called government failure. Governments are not perfect. When you compare the two, classical liberals believe that most of the time, government failure is worse than market failure. So simply the fact that the markets don't work does not in itself justify government action. So classical liberals tend to be in favor of deregulation and lower taxes. 8, people have very different values and beliefs. Pluralism. So we can only live together with people who have these different values and beliefs by showing toleration, by not interfering when we disagree with that person's, other people's behavior. We may disapprove, but we don't believe it's the job of government to stop people doing things of which we disapprove. So for example, there should be freedom of speech, even for people saying bad things, say white supremacists. The only limit should be when they threaten violence against others. 9th principle, peace. The lack of violence is a precondition for people to live their lives. That's why classical liberals believe that the primary role of government is to provide peace. And they support the existence of the police to try and limit violence domestically. And they tend to support the existence of the military to prevent violence from abroad. The problem is, of course, is that both the police and the military are themselves use violence. So we must be very careful in constraining and limiting, making them accountable for when for those institutions. They may be inevitable, but we need to make sure that they are constrained. So, for example, in foreign policy, classical liberals tend to favor less intervention in foreign policy. And then the 10th and final principle is that government should be strictly limited, both in scope, the areas that it covers, and size. But classical liberals disagree about how limited that should be. If you want to explore that more, one of the links you'll get is my series of lectures on schools of classical liberal thought, which demonstrate how they disagree on how limited government should be, even though they believe it must be limited. Now, I expect many of you are interested in specific policies that concern you. So classical liberals sometimes talk about the 3 I's, that when you look at any specific policy, you should ask yourself the 3 questions. First of all, incentives. How do policies affect how people pursue their own self-interest? So, for example, in the United States, there's a big discussion at the moment about qualified immunity that makes it very difficult to prosecute police when they do something wrong, because the rules have created incentives that make them able to carry out bad behavior with suffering no consequences for bad behavior. So the first thing to look at is incentives. The second thing when you're looking at a policy is to look at information. This is sometimes called the knowledge problem. Who has the best information to make decisions? Classical liberals say normally the knowledge can be found at the local level, indeed at the individual level often, rather than having decisions taken by people at the top who don't have that knowledge. And the third I is institutions. Do the institutions that exist encourage the best decisions? Do the institutions who makes the decisions are those with the best incentives and the best information? So 10 key principles of classical liberalism and some thoughts about how you can apply them to specific policy areas. The next thing I want to do is to compare classical liberalism with what's sometimes called modern liberalism, but I actually prefer the term welfare liberalism. Oh, sorry, let me leave that later. Let me deal first of all with something else. Let me compare classical liberalism with conservatism. That might be more helpful. So in the post-war period, classical liberals and conservatives have often been political allies. They found lots of things in common. They emphasize the importance of freedom, opposition to the growth of the state, communism as the greatest threat to free societies. But there's always been this tension between whether you want to emphasize liberty or whether you want to emphasize order. Classical liberals, as I've already mentioned, put liberty first. Conservatives tend to be skeptical about liberty. They think you need order that comes from above. It's the role of government to promote, if you like, a virtuous society, because order is so fragile. Conservatives believe in order, but they want to rely more on a bottom-up approach, spontaneous order. Famous classical liberal Friedrich Hayek wrote a famous essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative, where he identified 6 key differences. First of all, conservatives fear change, while classical liberals embrace change, despite its unpredictability. We don't always know where this change will eventually result. Conservatives tend to defer to authority, while classical liberals question it, are skeptical about it. So, for example, you see a big difference between attitudes to the police between conservatives and classical liberals. 3, conservatives are suspicious of the people, suspicious of democracy. They favor rule by elites, while classical liberals favor democracy, they support democracy, but they are in favor of a particular type of liberal democracy. Yes, the people should be engaged in making decisions, but we also need strong protections for minorities. Classical liberals are hostile to a majoritarian, unlimited democracy, which has no limit on what the political system does, and where the majority can impose its views on the minority. Fourth, conservatives fear new ideas, while classical liberals embrace them. You see this, for example, in the reaction to the growth of artificial intelligence. Conservatives fear that this will have bad consequences. They see that it's a threat to humanity, whereas classical liberals broadly think that artificial intelligence will be a beneficial for society. Fifth, conservatives tend to be hostile to internationalism and embrace nationalism. And you see this increasingly so with regard to populist nationalism. While classical liberals are internationalists and suspicious of nationalism, classical liberals tend to embrace globalization. Six, conservatives tend to look to religion for inspiration for secular decisions. So while classical liberals tend to support a sharp distinction between the role of religion and the role of the state. So Hayek said why I'm not a conservative, because he sees these big differences between classical liberals and conservatives. Now, how far are we at the end of this alliance between conservatives and classical liberalism, as conservatives have seemed to become shifted more in favor of this populist nationalism? The third thing I want to do is to compare welfare liberalism and classical liberalism. Welfare liberalism is a term I use. Some people use the term modern liberalism or left liberalism. So in the 19th century, liberalism had a united view generally about the things that were important to them. It was individualistic. It placed the freedom of the individual against the collective or the group. It was universal. It believed that freedom applied to all human beings, that everyone had moral worth or moral status. This concept I talked about, a human dignity. And much of the work of liberalism in the 19th, and I would say also in the 20th century, was to say how these principles of equal moral worth needed to be applied to everyone in society, regardless. So, for example, classical liberals often at the forefront of support for women's rights or in the forefront of gay rights, not arguing that they had special rights, but that the rights that belonged to everyone were being denied to certain people in society. So they were universal. Liberals are usually internationalists. That is, they believe that everyone, regardless of their national status, where they come from, are entitled to certain rights. You shouldn't distinguish between people based on their nationality. And fourth, they are meliorists. This is a term that is less used these days. What I mean by meliorist is that classical liberals believe that you can create a better society, but they're not utopian. They do not believe you can create a utopian society which is perfect, but you can make changes to make things better. This is the big theme of Steven Pinker's book about the decline of violence. We haven't created a society where there's no violence, but there's significantly less violence now than there was. You can create a better society. So in the 19th century, there was a broad consensus among liberals in favor of laissez-faire economics, of free trade, the democracy as a check on government, the centrality of private property, the moral value of the individual, the abolition of slavery, a distrust of government. In the 19th century, the big debate between liberals was whether you emphasize utilitarianism, the happiness of the greatest number, or by an appeal to natural rights derived from God or reason. And this is still a central debate among classical liberals, is are they utilitarians, or perhaps sometimes the term is sometimes used, consequentialists, or are they more arguments based more on natural rights? A key moment in the history of liberalism, I think, occurred with John Stuart Mill in his work on political economy, where he made a sharp distinction between the production of wealth and the distribution of wealth. He saw them as two separate questions. So he thought that you could change the distribution of wealth and it would have no effect on the production of wealth. Whereas classical liberals believe if you change the distribution, for example, through massive redistribution or through high levels of taxation, then that will lead to a reduce in the production of wealth. And I think this now is one key difference between classical liberals and so-called welfare liberals, is can you have redistribution without having negative effects on the production of wealth? So what you saw was a rise of this new liberalism at the end of the 19th century and the period of the early 20th century. So now I want to look at what is the difference between classical liberals and welfare liberals, who historically were quite close to each other, but I think there are now significant differences between them. The first big difference, I think, is how is freedom defined? Classical liberals have what's called, or so-called, negative conception of freedom, although I hate the term negative because that sounds bad. A negative conception of freedom is the absence of interference by others, while welfare liberals have a positive conception of freedom. That means the ability to satisfy your wants. Isaiah Berlin made this famous distinction, Oxford philosopher, made this famous distinction between positive freedom and negative freedom. And he argues that positive freedom is not freedom at all. It says something completely different, perhaps best called ability. So for example, I don't have the ability to jump 10 feet up in the air, but nobody is stopping me from doing that. No, other people are not stopping me from doing that. It's something to do with physical reality. So what do we mean when we use the freedom? Are we using it in this, quote, negative, non-interference sense, or in this positive, I have the ability to do something? Classical liberals, they tend to see government as coercive, as a fundamental characteristic of it is that it uses force or the threat of force to achieve its goals. While welfare liberals tend to have a positive view about government. They see government as liberating people from the constraints of society. So should we be cautious about government because of its coercive nature? Although do we think it actually is a good thing that promotes the common good, if you like? 3, classical liberals see private property as a fundamental right that it is most important to protect. While welfare liberals see private property as only one right among many and might be sacrificed for other goods. We saw this, for example, in the reaction to looting during the current demonstrations. classical liberals see looting, destroying, stealing private property from businesses as a major problem, as an act of violence, while welfare liberals tend to dismiss it, oh, it's only property, it's not that important. So how important is private property? 4, classical liberals believe in free markets, while liberals tend to favor more state intervention in the economy. They've lost their understanding, if you like, that liberals used to have about the importance of free markets. 5, classical liberals believe that the primary provision of welfare for the poor and those in difficulty should be placed in the community, in civil society, while welfare liberals believe it is the responsibility of the welfare state. Although there is now a big debate among classical liberals about whether they should support a universal basic income. That is, everyone should be entitled to a certain minimum income. Well, classical liberals so think that that should replace the welfare state, not be added to the welfare state. 6, classical liberals believe that justice is about fair rules, the fair procedural, a so-called procedural theory of justice, while welfare liberals believe in fair results, the so-called social justice. So different conceptions about what we mean by justice. 7, classical liberals believe in equality before the law, as I discussed before, under the rule of law, while welfare liberals believe that the state should guarantee some level of economic equality. 8th and final difference between them is that classical liberals believe that government should be restrained and limited, while welfare liberals believe that the job of government is to pursue the common good, and therefore any constraints you place on government should be removed. They're preventing what they see as good things. So is the priority, welfare liberals would say, the priority is enabling government to do good things, while classical liberals tend to emphasize the priority with government is to prevent it from doing bad things. Now, one question is how welfare liberals now moved so far away from liberalism as traditionally understood, are they still liberals? Many of them are now embracing the term progressive. What does progressive mean? Well, I think it has 4 characteristics. One is that the individual is to be subordinate to the common good. Second, that decisions should be taken by experts. There tends to be a distrust of ordinary people. Third, that economic equality is a primary goal of government, even at the expense of liberty. And fourth, that group identity is more important than the individuals. So the term, in my view, liberal is often applied to people who are not liberal. They are now something distinctive. And the term I would prefer to use for them is progressive. So when we hear somebody being described as a liberal, are they genuinely a liberal? For example, do they emphasize freedom and the individual? Or are they in fact something different, a progressive? The fourth thing I want to do, I've got time, is to compare classical liberalism with populism. Classical liberals are deeply suspicious of the populist term. Now, what is populism? There's a lot of debate about that. Sometimes it's used as a description of a style of politics. I tend to think of populism as a political movement led by charismatic individuals using fiery rhetoric against the elite and claiming to act on behalf of the whole people. The populist style, in my view, can be both right-wing and left-wing. In the United States, for example, Donald Trump is a populist, Bernie Sanders is a populist. And populism as a set of values tends to be in favor of protectionism, against globalization. It tends to be it tends to be nationalist, skeptical of cooperating with other countries, and a lack of concern about the constraints on government. And finally, I would say populism believes that businesses should act in the interests of the nation, as politicians conceive it, rather than the interests of the company. So I would say that populism is diametrically opposed to liberalism, which, as I said before, believes in free trade and internationalism, restraints on government, and that businesses should be allowed to operate in a free market. So in conclusion, what I want to say is, what is the future of classical liberalism in the modern world, where these ideas that were spreading for 75 years, having enormous benefits for people in both economically, socially, and peacefully, those ideas are now under a direct threat. How should classical liberals respond to that? Should they try and retrieve that traditional alliance with conservatives, or has conservatism now been embraced by this populist nationalism? Should classical liberals try to create an alliance with welfare liberals, but have welfare liberals now become no longer liberals, but are now progressives? And clearly, we should not ally ourselves with populism, although I know there are some classical liberals who find that attractive, but no, I think we should completely reject that of populism. Or should classical liberals try to maintain itself as a separate movement, declaring its own ideas, disagreeing with others in these other ideologies? The danger there is it may be seen to be irrelevant, as not having an influence in the modern world. My current thinking, which I should say has shifted over time, is that now it's important for classical liberals to stand up for its own ideas, to promote its own ideas, even at the expense of political influence in the short term, in the belief that will have an important impact in the long term. So I now throw it open to you for your questions and discussion. What do you like about classical liberalism? What do you dislike about classical liberalism? What do you think the future of classical liberalism should be in these current dark times? Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Nigel. It was indeed comprehensive. And thank you for pointing out the important differences between terms like conservatism, populism, because what we're seeing is a crisis of semantics. We see people attributing libertarianism with republicanism or the Republican Party, and then there's a straitjacket drawing of things. So before we move on to the question answer session, I have a small question for you so we can set the ball rolling. The first question that I'd like to ask you is that we have a discourse over the internet and everywhere about classical liberal ideas or free market ideas being no longer relevant because we're seeing a pandemic. So, and many people have argued that, a pandemic is a public health crisis. People have invoked the non-aggression principle. So how do we respond to this? And how do we talk about our ideas and their relevance during a pandemic?
Right. So, yes, I think that the pandemic leads to very specific problems for liberals, classical liberals, because they believe in the freedom of the individual, but they also believe in this harm principle. That is, you should not act in a way that can harm others. And the problem with this virus is that you can harm people, you can spread the infection to other people, even unintentionally. So this, I think, is an area where classical liberals accept that there has to be some limits on people's freedom. What I think they're skeptical about is that the way of dealing with the pandemic is to have centrally imposed decisions on what people should do. They think you should make people aware of its existence. You should make people aware of how to involve spreading the infection, wearing face masks, social distancing, washing your hands. But you should leave it to individuals and to businesses and to organizations to decide for themselves what is the best way of dealing with this problem. And the reason we tend to, or classical liberals believe, it's better to leave it to decentralize decisions is because of what I mentioned before, incentives and information. Who has the best incentive for deciding if I'm going to open my business, what is the best way to do it that will encourage people to come to my business? If I don't do a very good job, people won't come. So they have the incentive to creating the best conditions for their particular business. And they also have the information. They know what the conditions are in their own society, in their own village, in their own town, what is necessary to deal with it. So for example, in the United States, life is very different if you're living in New York City and if you're living in South Dakota, a state with very little population. So classical liberals tend to say, let's leave decisions as far as possible to a lower level, while it is the responsibility of government to make people aware of what the problems are. So classical liberals have tended to be skeptical about lockdowns. They would say that the evidence shows that the public was already responding to the problem of the virus before lockdowns were introduced. So in fact, you didn't need government lockdowns for people to voluntarily respond to what the situation is. There's been a lot of interest in Sweden where they did not pursue a lockdown policy, where many things were allowed to operate traditionally. They have had a high death rate, but overwhelmingly they were in nursing homes where there was no attempt to limit access to nursing homes. And this has been obviously a problem around the world, but the high rate of deaths in Sweden can be attributed to that. So if you're interested in more about how classical liberals should respond to the pandemic, I would suggest two things. You might want to Google Tom Palmer, Liberalism and Pandemics. And you might want to look at the work of my friend Phil Magnus, Magnes, who's written a lot on the classical liberals and the pandemics in a website called the American AIER, I forgot what it's called now, American Institute for Economic Research, AIER.org. So you're right, it's been a major challenge for classical liberals. And I do worry that the result of this will be that it's strengthened illiberal forces. And we need to think about how in the post-pandemic, as we're coming out of the pandemic, how can classical liberals best articulate why a free society would be the best way of dealing with those problems?
Thank you so much. And in fact, our viewers have been following this conversation. Someone asked another question on the same front. Dennis from India asks that decisions are to be taken at local level, but unlike having central planning, shouldn't governments formulate central strategies to facilitate our conduct in the crisis?
So a lot depends on what you mean by central strategies. I think government has a role to say, this is what the virus is, this is how it's spread, here's what we suggest is the way for you as an individual, as a business, as a church, how should the best way of dealing with the responsibilities. What I think the problem that occurs is when we say the government or centrally tells you, this is what you should do, is the problem. So yes, they have a role in spreading information, they have a role in providing guidance, but I'm very much hostile to the idea of government imposing its view. So a lot depends what he means by strategies. I'm not saying the central government has no role to play. It depends what you mean by strategy.
Yes. So um, that's interesting. And someone actually asked a question on the personal liberty front as well. So we have the question is that could you please throw some more light regarding the thin line of difference between freedom of speech and hate speech? And just adding on to that, there is this conversation about whether sunlight is actually the best disinfectant or not, in terms of certain speech identified as racist or anti-Semitic or so on.
Yeah, so I think, and I and most classical liberals, we're strongly in favor of freedom of speech because we think that bad ideas are best driven out by being, as you use the term, in the sunlight. If somebody, for example, is an anti-Semite or a racist, we actually want to know that they're an anti-Semite, that they are a racist. We want them to express their ideas, that idea, so that then the rest of us can then say, look, this is a bad person. This is not somebody, he's wrong because of these reasons. He's not a person that you want to follow. You should avoid interacting with this person or with this group. If you don't do that, then these bad ideas will be out there, but they will be underground. Now, as I said, the limits to that is that people should not be entitled to advocate violence against others. So there has been developed over a long period of time rules about when you move and cross that particular barrier. I'm personally very uncomfortable, though, with the idea that hate speech, that speech that you express that is against another group in society, religious group, for example, a racist group, that in itself should be illegal. That I find very troubling. We want hate speech to be presented so that we can condemn it, that hate speech, and prevent it from being spread. Now, I'm not denying that hate speeches can be hurtful. That it is not a very nice thing to be told that your group in society has these terrible conditions. The big question, though, is what is the most effective way of reducing that? For those who are interested in this, exploring this in the context of free speech, my institute, the Institute of Humane Studies, we have a section on our website on free speech and open inquiry about the importance of having open debate, open dialogue, open differences, and why that's extremely valuable.
Thank you so much. That answers the question very well, and I am sure that our viewers are going to check out more on that. The next question, and it's something that you haven't touched upon in your talk about classical liberalism, but I'll leave it up to you if you'd like to answer that. Is that, do you think that Nozic's principles of initial holdings and of acquisition are satisfied in the trade purported by today's transnational capitalist order? There are many terms used here, so I'm not sure what they mean.
Yeah, so but my worry is that this question will have very little meaning for the vast majority of people who are listening to this particular topic. So rather than get into too much detail, what I would recommend is to have a look at my videos on schools of classical liberalism. And one section, I talk about Robert Nozick and his conceptions of this. If that person wants to contact me, I can just discuss in more detail that particular topic. But I said, I worry that most people have no idea what we're talking about, and so may not be the best use of our time.
Yeah,
Do get in contact with me afterwards.
yes, I'll make sure that happens. And I
I'm
just
not trying to
ensured,
avoid the question, but
yeah, and I just made sure that, the question gets the sunlight.
yeah, no, totally.
So the next question that's very interesting, and many people have found out this, and you have talked about in your talk about unfettered majoritarian democracy. The question is about democracy seems to punch away society from libertarianism. Uh, can we achieve libertarian ends through democracy, uh, given that the idea of democracy is more or less a majoritarian rule?
So this, I think, is a very important question about what do we mean by democracy? So democracy comes from ancient Greek. It means rule by the people. But the ancient Greeks thought democracy was a bad thing. It wasn't a system that they wanted to encourage. It was a bad thing for a variety of reasons. And I discuss this in my chapter on democracy in my book, Principle of Free Society. But they worry that democracy would lead to the majority oppressing the minority. That in a democracy, people will be driven by emotion rather than by reason. So democracy, as the Greeks understood it, was not a very good system. But I think in the 19th century, we developed a conception of liberal democracy, which means, yes, political decisions should be taken by democratic means through representative assemblies, for example, not by referendums. But the role of democracy in society should be strictly limited. There's only a limited number of things which should be decided politically. And within a democracy, yes, there's majority rule, but there's also minority rights. There are things that the majority should not do against the minority. So classical liberals believe in a very specific conception of what a liberal democracy should be. The problem is, I think, is that that concept of a liberal democracy has been lost. Increasingly, people seem to be thinking that democracy means that the political system can do whatever it wants if enough people desire it. So rather than abandon democracy, we need to think of a way of how do we create a democracy that is more restrictive of liberty. Again, I'm an academic, so I'm always recommending books. Someone who takes a somewhat different position from that is my friend Jason Bremen, who's a philosophy professor, who's written a book called Against Democracy. Although I think actually we come of it from a very different point of view, so from a very similar point of view, I should say, but we disagree about what we mean by democracy.
Thank you. In fact, I've also witnessed many classical liberals saying that we must not deify democracy, not hold it to a pedestal that it does not deserve, and it's merely a means of doing something, not an end in itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
yes. Sorry.
Yeah,
so yeah, what I call democratic fetishism. So I'm a political scientist, so I read a lot of political science, and a great deal of political science seems to assume that the solution to every problem is more democracy. And I think that is a complete mistake. That should not be the primary goal, is more democracy. That more democracy can in fact make things worse for it. So yes, I have this skepticism about this obsession, this worship, I would call it, of democracy. Very skeptical towards that.
Thank you so much in that. We have another question, and this is more towards the economic side of things. So how can problems that require large-scale collective initiative of some form be addressed according to libertarianism? The examples are climate change,
Uh,
and
yeah,
that's a question that has always been put forward.
yeah. So I would say that most environmental issues are best dealt with at a local level. But I think you're right. Climate change does create very specific problems of a collective action policy. What I would say, though, is that people have become more and more aware of climate change and have found ways of trying to deal with it at their own level. What I worry about is I worry about creating some sort of international organization laying down rules to try and deal with climate change. Remember, I want to come back to things I talked about before. The problem with any international organization is, will it have the right incentives? Does it have the incentive to deal with climate change while at the same time not destroying the economy? And does it have the knowledge or information to know what is the right thing to do in very different circumstances? So I don't think classical liberals do have an easy answer to climate change. What I would say is that they suggest you should be deeply skeptical about that some international organization or plan can solve this problem. So it's a little bit like the debate between there is such a thing as market failure and there is such a thing as government failure. To demonstrate that there is such a thing as a climate change problem does not in itself mean that creating an international institution with political power will solve that particular problem.
Thank you so much for that. In fact, we have many organizations, if I'm not mistaken, who are working towards achieving market solutions to environmental problems. One such would be the Property and Environment Research Center,
Yeah.
uh, the American Conservation Coalition,
Mhm.
and so on. So I think we do have people. Yes.
Could I just mention one thing? Sorry, again, I'm always recommending reading. So you might want to look at the work of Mark Pennington, who is a classical liberal professor at King's College London. He's done a great deal of work on how classical liberals should approach environmental issues. Mark Pennington.
Thank you so much. In fact, these references are going to be very helpful for our viewers, and I'm going to go back and read some myself. One question before we run out of time, and this is a question that has always been in our part of the world. It's very important in South Asia. The difference between what we call a capitalist free market society and cronyism. And more often than not, people, when we talk about free markets, we run into that cronyism question.
Yeah, yeah. So no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's very unfortunate this term crony capitalism has become most widespread, because I prefer to use the idea of a free market as a better conception, that people voluntarily exchange with each other. Unfortunately, increasingly as government has grown, it has acted in ways which benefit some in society rather than in others. So with protectionism, very often it's a particular sector of the economy which is protected. Or you may have the licensing, which benefits some people at the expense of others. So I think crony capitalism is a problem, but the way to look at it is not to have less capitalism, but to have more free market. Again, if you're interested in this question, the Moderator Center has a project on corporate welfare and crony capitalism, which talks more about this distinction.
Thank you so much for that. We have come towards the end of this conversation. It was very fruitful, and then there is a wide area for people to read And then you've pointed out many readings and resources. And with our viewers, we'll also be sharing an email that Nigel will share with us on classical liberal ideas and the resources they can use for it. Thank you, Dr. Nigel, for joining us. And I really appreciate the work that you've been doing. I mean, I have personally reached out to you many times in terms of my own academic activities. It's wonderful for you to know someone who has been working so hard for classical liberal ideas.
Thank you very much, and thank you much for all you're doing and your organization.